I'm no hero, at least not now. The last time I did anything brave was a long time ago. In 4th grade, actually. There was a girl in my grade named Cindy Van Dyck. Not popular, not well-dressed, and not well-off. Her red hair was dark and dull, hardly ever washed, and she had freckles, not the cute dusting across the nose that some girls had. It was one of those blustery fall days, with a damp wind that came up extra cold. The kind where nobody's parents had dressed them quite heavily enough. So we clung close to the school during recess to stay out of the harshest part of the wind. That kind of concentration of 4th graders reaches critical mass quickly. For whatever reason, Cindy Van Dyck somehow became the focus of a random rush of grade school cruelty. I don't really remember the exact nature of the Cindy contagion, but I do remember that if you wanted to remain untouched, you had to stay off whatever 8x6 block of playground concrete she was on. The effect was like a reverse magnet, with hordes of 4th graders rushing to evacuate to safe places, leaving a miserable Cindy surrounded by a bubble of loneliness. I have no idea what possessed me to stand my ground as she trudged toward me, a cloud of misery hovering around her. Maybe at first, I was playing the game too, and by staying in place, I was showing I wasn't afraid of our newly minted outcast. If so, it didn't last past a single look at her downcast eyes. I had been singled out just a couple of months before for the crime of wearing a t-shirt with the Butterfinger candy bar logo on it. I'd suffered my sentence of carrying Butterfingers as my nickname for a month. As if life wasn't tough enough at that age when you were already named Calvin Pickman. I'd shaken those chains off and gone back to my given name just a week ago. So as she stepped onto my block when I was supposed to jump clear, I just stood there and said, "Hey." She watched me warily for some clever trick. She knew how the game was played too. She couldn't believe anyone would defy the will of the crowd. After a minute, she nodded, and I went back to rearranging pebbles for some mystic 4th grade reason. I could feel the communal outrage build as the crowd realized, in its dim emotional collective conscience, that I was refusing to play along. There was a slow but certain realization that I'd have to be punished, at the very least, ostracized along with her. I was, as they say, well and truly screwed. I'd even done it fully knowing the consequences. My salvation came in the form of another redhead, Laura, a skinny, fearless, copper-haired girl with slightly ragged clothes. She'd never been afraid before and barely had 2 words for me in our 5 years as classmates. Maybe she really stepped in as a member of the secret Redhead Mutual Aid Society. Regardless of the reason, the equation changed as soon as she stepped onto that forlorn block of concrete desert with us. Laura was nobody to trifle with. She had an explosive temper and long, sharp nails that she wouldn't hesitate to bring into play. Many of our classmates had felt her wrath. She glared around with blazing, forest green eyes at the suddenly cowed mob, daring them to do or say one thing. The nasty energy of the crowd evaporated in the heat of her stare. Kids were suddenly drifting away, finding other things to do, leaving the 3 of us standing uncomfortably on our stronghold. Cindy glanced around, not quite sure what to make of her rescue, and hastily retreated to the safety of the space near the classroom door, where there was real teacher oversight. She would disappear after the end of the school year. Move to Ohio, I think someone said. I don't remember for certain, but I remember hoping she fared better there. I really did. Laura and I just stood, ignoring each other for a long while. She finally gave me a curt nod and headed toward the Foursquare area, where her friends were waiting. Later that year, Laura would mark my arm with her nails in a rather one-sided discussion over the use of a jungle gym. But compared to the usual way she dealt with interlopers into her chosen domain, it was rather mild. We weren't friends, not really, but we nodded to each other in passing. Eventually, the popular girls brought her into their fold, although she never seemed as cruel and heartless as the rest of the Amy and Angie popular girl crew tended to be. For my part, I trudged along in my hand-me-down clothes with my nose buried in whatever book I dug out of the school library. By the end of 8th grade, Laura's buck teeth had turned into a brilliant smile, and her figure, Well, suffice it to say it looked like she had transformed into one of the popular girls. Somewhere along the way, she changed her ragged clothes for fashionable ones, and she'd been immediately swept into the cheerleader and athlete world of the beautiful. Meanwhile, I had slogged into the lower-end brains category. As we felt our way through high school, I actually managed not to completely screw up. I passed with pretty good, though not great, grades and had a genuine girlfriend named Carrie, until her parents moved to Colorado, right after my senior prom. By the time we graduated, my fourth-grade heroics were long forgotten, and I probably said only 2 sentences to Laura in the last 3 years, partly because no girlfriend would want her boyfriend talking to the most beautiful girl anyone could imagine, and partly because Laura moved in different circles. Once in a while, passing each other in the hallway, we'd nod and say, "Cal" and Laura to each other, but nothing more. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me, and it was like we both hastily looked away. Even thinking about her felt risky. She had a college boyfriend with a flashy car. I think the boyfriend actually changed often, but they were hard to tell apart. I decided to skip college, mostly due to a lack of money for such things, and continued working at the auto parts store where I had been for the last 2 years. After 6 months, when the Army recruiter told me about how I could finance college with a 4-year enlistment, I decided to give it a shot. I'd be getting on the bus to basic training on January 2nd. I had no great dreams, but I scored big on the test for learning languages and requested to be a Chinese linguist, as I'd heard it translated to a lot of college credits. For my last hurrah, I decided to attend Joe Pedon's New Year's Eve party. He was a year older than me and had the cool parents who, since the year he turned 16, simply disappeared for about 3 days before and a week after New Year's, giving him plenty of time to plan, execute, and clean up. Needless to say, this time was not wasted. He had the craziest parties, or so I'd heard. Having a full-time girlfriend, whose idea of celebrating New Year's was much more intimate, had prevented me from joining the festivities before. Of course, I'd run into problems. My cousin needed help moving to his new house, and I'd been roped in under the pretext of seeing him one last time before basic training. So after an 18-hour day, I made it to the party after it had been in full swing for a couple of hours, and I was completely wiped out. I managed 1 rum and coke, and then asked Joe if I could lie down for half an hour in one of the guest rooms. He promised to send someone in to get me in 30 minutes. I basically missed the whole party. As raw morning light filtered through my eyelids, I shifted, and someone spoke in a hushed tone. "Where's your shirt?" I managed to blink one eye open and look to my left. A single sparkling green eye was visible through the mass of golden red hair resting on my bare chest. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second and reopened them, sharpening the image. "Unless you have a Rolling Stones concert t-shirt of your own, you're wearing it." There was a brief pause as she swiveled her head a bit and looked between us. "Huh. Okay then. Where's my shirt?" I shifted and realized my left hand was resting on a firm surface, and one of her long legs was draped across mine. I kept my hand right where it was to avoid drawing attention to it. Seriously, I knew that voice. I still had scars on my arm from crossing her at the jungle gym all those years ago. At least I was still wearing boxers, although I had no idea where my jeans had gone. She moved to get more comfortable, and I must have returned to the party and gotten completely intoxicated. However, I didn't have the splitting headache or that unpleasant taste in my mouth I remembered from the previous times I had too much to drink. All in all, the gods had been kind, and now I had to figure out how to get out of this situation unscathed. From the times I'd seen Laura with boyfriends, they resembled the more powerful of the great apes. They had just gotten even bigger and meaner looking since she started college. They would only become a problem if I survived Laura's legendary temper. I kind of figured out what happened, though. Good old Joey Pedon had a sense of humor. If you passed out at one of his parties, he played tricks on you, like shaving your eyebrows or marking you up with permanent marker. Of Laura, she shifted her head to clear her other eye, so I could see both of them. I think Joey got the drop on us. I didn't remember getting drunk, but I was really tired and must have passed out. I'm guessing you did the same." She pulled herself partly up and leaned across my chest to squint at the clock on the bedside table. "It's 9 o'clock. The damage is done. There's no way anyone is going to believe we weren't in here together all night." She didn't seem really upset by that. She was silent for a long moment, still resting on my chest. "Did you hear you're headed off to the army?" "Yeah, on the bus tomorrow." "Still a hero, huh?" My confusion must have been obvious. I was a lot of things, but hardly a hero. In 4th grade, you stood up to everybody at one time to protect someone that nobody even liked. You're the only hero I have ever really met. I laughed. I was stupid. If you hadn't shown up, I'd have been ostracized for the rest of my life. "You're the hero." She shook her head. "I did the right thing because you showed what it was." I was about to respond when she abruptly pulled herself up. I started to object, but she grounded herself against me, and I lost the capacity for speech. She smiled her brilliantly warm smile. "Everybody is going to assume we were together all night anyway, no matter what we claim." She peeled the t-shirt off over her head in one motion. She was even more stunning than I had imagined. The next couple of hours were spent engaging in playful interactions, the kind everyone would believe we were having anyway. It was about as much fun as you can have in bed, on the floor, or over a chair. We managed to find our clothes under the chair, and Laura didn't seem to care who knew what we were up to. She was vocal about it. If anyone in the house had any doubts about what we were doing, she dispelled them quickly and frequently. We lay there tangled together for a long while, her voice almost a whisper, as if she was talking in church. "I came here on purpose. Calendar, I had to do this once. I had to break Mom's rules and try out a real guy. Someone who cares about someone other than himself." I looked at Laura, but her eyes were downcast. "What do you mean, Mom's rules?" She grimaced and started talking, muffled and sad. Her mom had married her great love, a great guy who would do anything for her, but he had been laid off when Laura was in grade school. After years of low-rent housing and struggling to keep a life going for them, Laura's mom, almost as beautiful as Laura, had remarried for money, saying, "Love doesn't keep a roof over your head." When we finally got dressed, we walked out through a humgover crowd that watched us with raised eyebrows. Laura stopped at the door and gave me a lingering kiss. "Stay a hero," she whispered, and then she was gone. I discovered a lot about myself in the army. Basic training sucks. The most important thing a drill sergeant teaches you is that no matter how pessimistic you are, you're even more worthless than you think. I also discovered that when you sign up for a language, that's exactly what you're doing. Signing up for a language, not the one you thought you were choosing. I didn't even know Shona was a language, much less that it's centered in Zimbabwe. It also meant that my clever idea of going to language school in California so I could surf was not going to happen. Shona was taught in a grim contract school in Virginia. After I finished training, I was off to Fort Bragg as a brand new private first class. I should have spent the next year learning how to be a soldier, but I was immediately sent to support a special forces team on a 6-month deployment in Africa. I didn't think I'd done much more than stay out of the way, but a letter of commendation reached my unit before I even got back. It quickly became a pattern. 6 months in Africa, more language training in other African languages, and another 6 months, and so on. 3 years of being loaned to every special forces team with missions in Africa set my course, and I finally applied for airborne school. Then the Q course, the Special Forces Selection Course. If I was going to be doing this anyway, I might as well get all the training. It sure as hell wasn't easy, and it gave me a new respect for the guys I'd been working with. For the next 7 years, I spent about half my time in Africa, mostly trying to avoid getting shot or catching something incurable, while I used the time to finish my degree in corporate security. I learned more about the rivalries, connections, and dynamics of Africa. I imagined myself becoming part of the web, becoming part of Africa. I was that guy, the one who spoke the languages, understood the people, and reminded everyone that it was Africa, and that's the way it goes. I probably would have worked there for the rest of my career, untangling the complexities of the continent. Until I went to the market, I was looking for trinkets for family members, some food for the team house, nothing really important. I was just killing some time. I had just finished my degree before returning for the deployment, and for the first time in a long time, I had no reading to do, no papers to worry about. My weekends were my own for a change. I was probably 100 feet away when I saw her. She was young, terribly young, and very pregnant, but it was her eyes that caught me. The soft, warm brown African eyes that I'd always thought were so special. They were the thing about Africa I'd always remembered. Yet her eyes were different, empty, hollow. All that remained in them was the vacant stare of the dead. She saw me, looked into my eyes, and she knew that I knew. I yelled, "No." I tried, but it made no difference at all. A young girl kidnapped from her school by self-serving religious fanatics, tortured, abused, and brainwashed. She was little more than a weapon by the time I saw her. Maybe with time and effort, somebody could have recovered that lost girl, but there was no time. The explosion of the suicide vest slammed fragments through the packed crowd. I was unharmed. The layers of almost 100 innocent victims, men, women, and children, between us had absorbed the fragments. I helped the ones that I could. I was physically unharmed, but hardly unscathed. The cynicism that I wore as armor had shredded in that single, eternal stare. I wasn't part of Africa after all, and I never could be. No matter how long I stayed, I'd always be a visitor, always be an outsider. I dropped my plans for reenlistment and put out my resume. I barely had it out before the corporate headhunters started calling. Special Forces experience combined with a degree in corporate security was a very attractive combination for many companies. It seemed like a fair trade. An occasional visit to Africa, usually to a nice hotel, for 5 times my pay in a plush office, against 10 more years of deployments to every disease and insurgent-infested corner of Africa. It really wasn't much of a challenge to pick the winning hand in this game. Maybe someday, if I was lucky, I'd even forget those eyes. The winner, at least to me, was Cantic Services Incorporated. They had opened a new satellite office outside the Highway 35 loop of Dallas, and they were planning some business operations in Africa in the future. A security manager with experience in Africa was just about perfect for them. They couldn't justify hiring a full-time Africa expert by himself, but my role in security allowed them to keep the expertise on hand while I worked full-time. I provided a bit of advice on Africa while managing facility security. It didn't feel like a management position. There was no team to manage, more of a security coordinator role. I oversaw personnel security, but the guard force and computer security weren't mine, even though I had to work with them. I moved in the week before I started, choosing a single apartment not too far from my new workplace. I noticed a few pretty girls around the pool when I moved in, and a couple of them noticed me right back, so at least I had some off-work prospects. I decided that would have to wait until I got settled into work. The management board was fairly typical, mostly corporate drones, a lawyer and Alan Daniels, the director of the new division, and the son of the CEO. His father was preparing him to take over the whole thing. I got the impression he felt out of his depth, that maybe he felt he wasn't up to the task of being his father's heir. He had an air of desperate desire to be something, anything. Still, he seemed like a nice guy and spent a couple of minutes greeting me and talking about his fiancée, a woman named Karen, whom he'd met at a horse show. The board quickly welcomed me and handed me off to Human Resources. The head of Human Resources was Bethany, who reminded me of my 9th grade English teacher, a gray but sharp woman with a dry sense of humor. She handed me my personnel paperwork and led me to my new office, which was a bit smaller and more cookie-cutter than I dreamed, but better than a cubicle. I wasn't there 10 minutes before the phone rang. "Hey, this is Jesse with it," Bethany says we got to set you up with an account on the system, like today. You got a minute? Sure. Where are you? Bring your in-processing papers. Go out of your office, turn right, take the green corridor to the light blue, go left, left, and walk until you reach lemon yellow. My office is the first on the right. Sounds colorful. Welcome to Crayola land. 3 colors and a near miss on dark yellow. I walked into her office, and a pixie-ish woman with bright green hair and matching lipstick peered at me through green-framed glasses past her computer screen. Her blue eyes sparkled, and she smiled broadly. Hey, you made it. How do colorblind people get around here? I sneak out and leave cookie crumb trails. You'd be taking snickerdoodles to chocolate chip to peanut butter. She grinned mischievously, then launched into a horrible parody of a German accent, sticking her hand out. Your papers. I must have your papers. I handed them over and watched her hands blaze over the keyboard. She glanced down at the papers. Not married. You got a girlfriend. No time. Just got here, moved into my apartment a week ago. She wrinkled her nose like a bunny for a second. Then, what? I was going to flirt with you until you asked me out, but that could take half an hour and I have a lot to get done. It would work though. Once you asked me out, we'd have to go out for coffee, then a casual date of some kind. After that, you'd want to take me to a nice restaurant to make a good impression, so you'd ask me what kind of place I want to go. I figured we could fast forward through that stuff. She flashed an impish smile. I held my hands up in surrender. Okay, you figured out my plan. What time? 6:30. We'll walk. There's a new place that just opened up about 3 blocks from your apartment. This felt distinctly like a setup. Where do I pick you up? 3 floors down, apartment 6. I watched you move in. I looked at her with narrowed eyes. The girl by the pool in the blue bikini. Her suppressed giggle managed to burst out. The bikini you found so interesting that you didn't remember my face. Hey, you had on huge sunglasses and that big hat. There hadn't really been very much to the bikini, which was why it was so interesting, to be honest. Yeah, I saw what you were looking at, and it wasn't my hat. She gave me a sideways smile to let me know she wasn't offended. That was the start of a lot of good times. Jess was a Dallas native and knew every fun place to go. She'd lived in Austin for a while, which explained the hair. It didn't stay green. It changed often, and her lipstick and glasses changed with it. Stay weird, Austin, stay weird. She wasn't shy and didn't have any problems letting me know when she was interested in spending time together. She was honest and made it clear that she wasn't interested in a serious relationship right from the start, and that I was something of a break from all the drama. Conventional relationships just weren't her thing at all, but she only dated one guy at a time. While the logic didn't seem quite straightforward to me, it suited her quirky personality. Frankly, I was just having a good time anyway. I didn't really have time for a full-time relationship. I'd only been at Cantic for 6 weeks before I was called down to the CEO's main office in the heart of Dallas. After waiting an extra half hour, I was shown in to meet him. He was an older man in a $5,000 suit, with a perfect tan, perfect teeth, and a snow-white, perfect head of hair. He looked like he belonged in a movie or on a golf course. He got up and walked around the desk to meet me as I walked in, taking my hand in a perfect handshake, gripping just hard enough to show no sign of weakness, just light enough not to be overly aggressive. Calvin, welcome aboard. Thank you, sir. Glad to be here. Good to hear. How are you settling in? I'm doing well. The office is good, and my coworkers are friendly. In Jess's case, extremely friendly. That's good. Have a seat. He gestured to one of the chairs in front of his desk and sat in the one opposite it. He made small talk for a few more minutes before getting to the point. I need you to go to Kinshasa and make arrangements for meetings. We'll get you a contact list. This is just to lay the groundwork with businessmen and a few government officials. There's a lot of potential there. untapped resources, and we really need to set up contacts and get in on the ground floor. I kept a polite smile on my face. That's what they say. It was what they had been saying for decades. There was a running joke among a lot of Africa hands that Africa was the wealth of the future and always would be. Africa might have wealth, but it was far harder to exploit than all the businessmen ever dreamed. Safety, corruption, dysfunctional economics, and crime all created an atmosphere that always seemed to conspire to prevent the promise of Africa from paying off, especially in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic, aka the DRC, and the CR. Some kind of industrial chemical spill had killed nearly 300 people along the Ubangi River in the CR just a few months before I left the army. All that anyone had done was shrug and say, "It's Africa. That's the way it goes." Still, it was going to pay the bills, so I smiled and decided to go along with making arrangements for mid-level executive meetings. Some of the businessmen were almost certain to be con men, but that wasn't my concern. Everybody seemed happy, and it all felt pretty small-scale, so Kantik could easily absorb any financial losses. As I was getting ready to leave, a tall, stone-faced man came in unannounced. "Daniels," he nodded to him. "Calvin, this is Phillips. He's my chief of security and represents me when things go wrong." I extended my hand, but he just stood there and didn't respond. Phillips is a bit of a germaphobe. He really doesn't like to be touched. I nodded to him. "Nice meeting you." He only responded with a curt nod, and I left, thinking he was one of the creepiest men I'd ever met. The trips broke up the monotony of security programs and paperwork, so between Jesse and the coordinating trips, I certainly wasn't bored. Jesse always had me bring back mementos from the trips to Africa. Along with employment came social obligations. Mr. Daniels was adamant that everyone from the janitors on up make it to at least 4 of the 8 corporate mixers that he held every year. It was written into the employee handbook and reinforced frequently. They even sent out RSVP cards, and secretaries and office managers chased down answers. Bethany hinted, and Jesse confirmed that more was better. If you were out of town on business, that was fine. Just make a note of it in your regrets response. But if you had any chance of making it to the mixers, you should take it. Mr. Daniels attended every one of them and remembered every employee who showed up, which reflected in the end-of-year bonuses. Since 4 of the gatherings were barbecues, 2 were semi-formal, and only 2 formal, most people could find 4 they could tolerate. I figured I'd better attend as many as I could, and decided to drag Jesse along if possible. At least that way, it wouldn't be boring. I brought it up while we ate at a new Thai place Jesse had discovered. "I'm going to the 4th of July barbecue. Are you interested?" She shrugged, her fluorescent purple hair bouncing. I could be. It's more of a family event, but they rent out the whole resort. The rooms are free, and the food is always amazing. The only problem is that you have to participate in some of the events to go. I really need to hit as many of these mixers as I can, and I can't think of a better game partner than you. She flashed me a smile. I already looked up the events. I think we can place in the rock wall race because only one couple has signed up. I'm pretty good at trivia, so if I can con Bethany and her husband into teaming up with us, we have a shot at not looking like idiots. He's a history professor and wicked smart at trivia. We need one more event, right? Not the 30-second hot dog eating contest. I got talked into that last year. I won, but I got sick. Well, that explains why you were so good. Shut up, she glowered at me in mock fury. Okay, got it. So how about the mud run obstacle course race? It's the big event. It's on a Sunday, and the rock wall race is Saturday morning, so we'll have time to recover. I'm too short for the walls. I've done a lot of obstacle courses. It's practically an art form in the army. I know some tricks for walls. She shrugged. It's messy, but it might be fun. You sure you will be there? I don't want to be left hanging. I should be back at least 3 weeks before. I'm only going for 2 weeks this time. This whole thing is probably a waste of money on their part, but I'm doing my best, and I'm getting paid. Did you tell them? It seems pointless. I finished my bite of pad thai noodles. I did. I thought I was pretty circumspect, and I sent a nice polite note up the chain. The only one that responded was Phillips. He basically told me to shut up and do what I'm told. I've only met him a couple of times. He makes my skin crawl. He never says anything, just stares and looks at me like I'm an insect. I don't even know what he really does. None of the security people report to him. I know some of the meetings I've set up in the CAR and DRC are for him, but that's all. Jessie spooned some jungle curry onto her rice. I know he reports only to Mr. Daniels. I just don't trust him. All the stuff I've gotten from him seems, I don't know, condescending maybe. Probably just in a hole. You're the new guy who's done that cool special forces stuff. Maybe he's just jealous. I watched as our mango and sticky rice arrived. Just doesn't feel right. Our conversation turned back toward the 4th of July mixer. I did get back in time. Jess and I came in second in the rock wall race out of 5 couples. But honestly, 2 of them were doing it because everything else was full. Jessie turned out to be right about the trivia contest. It wasn't even close. I managed to answer 2 whole questions, and Bethany about 5. But Jessie and Ho, Bethany's husband, pretty much ran away with the competition, while we all drank too much and ate dry-aged steaks that must have cost $50 apiece. Despite her serious demeanor at work, after a couple of drinks, Bethany turned out to be hilarious. I asked her if she and Ho intended to run the mud race. Bethany rolled her eyes, snickering. I can't believe you're asking me that. Have you looked at the obstacles? The walls aren't all that bad. Forget the walls. It's the crawl-through pipes. There's no way in hell I'm getting this 42-inch butt through a 36-inch pipe. Jess, a little more than half-lit, began giggling uncontrollably at the image of Ho behind her pushing her through the pipes. Oh yeah, I know how that would go. If I got stuck in a pipe, the last thing on his mind would be helping me get loose. Jess spun an invisible lasso over her head, grinning from ear to ear. Bethany choked on her drink for a second. That'd be the last year we're allowed to attend. Her eyes widened. Hey, maybe we'll do it the year I retire. Go out with a bang. Jessie howled, and Ho nodded agreeably. Both women worked their way up to breathless laughter. I shook my head. Sorry, I asked. Ho gave a half smile. I kept forgetting to separate the 2 of them when they got to drinking. They'd really fed off each other. I could see that as he smiled fondly over at his wife for a second, then turned toward me. Bethany tells me you're the Africa expert, as well as the security manager. Daniels himself chose you. Alan's a pretty good guy, but I think the board probably identified me. He pursed his lips, puzzled. No, I'm sure she said it was the old man, not Alan. I started to ask, but Jessie fell back against me, laughing wildly at something Bethany had said. Ho held his hand up. Sorry, Cal, but I think we need to rope these 2 in and get them to bed before they go overboard. Bethany grabbed his hand. Come on, let's go practice that pushing technique. He shrugged helplessly as she dragged him away. I carried Jessie up and put her on the bed while I brushed my teeth. I was just thinking about Ho's confusion when I heard a noise behind me. Jessie stalked toward me, dropping her dress to the ground. The victory from the mud race and grilled steak-induced coma that we fell into later that night was well earned. It was a good thing the mud race started late, because we barely made it to the starting line at 8 o'clock. Not too many of the other runners looked all that less muddy than Jessie and me. Mr. Daniels made a few opening comments about the race symbolizing perseverance, and a lot of other stuff that I was frankly too tired to listen to. Then he fired the starting pistol. It was absolute chaos. At least 150 runners pouring into a 3-mile-long mud course that had been heavily watered for over a week. It was a sort of choose-your-own-destiny race, with about 6 different routes, each with different challenges. I half-dragged Jessie along since the start of the course was really deep mud. Less than 50 feet into it, not one runner was anything but a mud-colored blob. It was easy to see we weren't going to finish in the top 5. Some of the couples obviously took it really seriously and must have trained for how to run mud courses, but we struggled along, mostly laughing at each other. When one of the secretaries had her tube top pulled down to her waist by the mud, I cracked up. Who wears a tube top to a mud race? Jessie gasped for air. Tiffany always does. I think this is the 3rd year running she's lost her top that way. Not really an accident then. I think it is. It's her version of sitting on the copier to make Christmas cards. Can't really see anything with all the mud. I think that's the idea. Blatant exhibitionism without the actual risk. Daniels turns a blind eye to it. Laughing our way along, we managed to get 2 miles into the course before we saw somebody in real trouble. Shielded from nearly everyone by a clump of bushes, a woman had slipped and trapped her foot under a short wall. Her partner was frantically digging as quickly as possible to keep her from slipping under in the 3 feet of near-liquid mud. They must have been way ahead of us because he was obviously exhausted and starting to lose the fight to keep her from going under. We stumbled over to them. "You need a hand." The guy nodded, choking on air, unable to answer, while the woman looked at us with more than a bit of panic. Jessie immediately joined in, keeping her face clear of mud while pushing down and working an arm in to get her foot free. It didn't take long with the 3 of us working together, though she lost her shoe for good. I found a chunk of rock and jammed it in the gap under the wall to save the next person to come along. We stumbled along in a little group, him and me helping the girls over the walls, then pulling ourselves over. It was just a matter of height. The guy looked at me. I couldn't pull her out. "You have to break the suction. The mud's like quicksand. I'll send an email up the ladder and make sure they put people along the course for safety next year." He shook his head. "Don't worry about it. I got it covered." Once they scraped enough mud off their faces, it turned out our new friends were Alan and his fiancée, Karen. When we finally reached the end, they insisted we cross the line before them, because we'd stopped to help them. As we headed over to the wash-up station to clean up, Alan laughed as he washed the last of the mud out of his hair and off his face. "I was really hoping to place higher this year." Karen laughed. "We did okay. I survived, and for a while, it looked like that wasn't going to happen." Jessie pulled her waistband out and peered down into her shorts pensively, while Alan and I exchanged looks. Alan finally grinned. "My father paid for a very expensive brunch, and I think we need to make a serious dent in the champagne. Meet you there after we clean up a bit." I nodded. At least it had washed the taste of mud out of my mouth. We cleaned up and were back down in less than half an hour. Jessie paid tribute to the mud run with mud-brown hair, nail polish, and lipstick. Alan and Karen had grabbed a table and already heaped it with food and a chilled bottle of Moët and Chandon. "What did you do? Order 4 of everything?" Karen nodded and held up a chocolate-filled croissant, pointing to a plate with 3 more. "Better catch up, you two. I'm about to drown my memories of endless mud in chocolate." Jess and I dug in, laughing and joking with Alan and Karen. Karen seemed to have all the self-confidence and assuredness that I sensed lacking in Alan. She'd gotten her undergraduate degree at Wellesley, then moved on to an MBA at Harvard Business School. She seemed more comfortable with the idea of running a multinational company than Alan did. They really complemented each other. By the time we left, Alan and Karen had promised us an invitation to their wedding. The next few months were a whirlwind of work and trips. I traded emails with Alan, and we even managed several games of racquetball where we were pretty much evenly matched. We also shared a few beers together on occasion, until my trips to Africa picked up. I was gone for the next 2 mixers, which was disappointing, especially since Jessie managed to go to the Halloween party and told me that Tiffany dressed up as a character with a bit more skin showing. She did take pictures, though, and it was truly impressive. I asked about Alan and Karen, but she hadn't seen them there, which was odd. More bothersome was that something about the trips to Kinshasa was starting to seem peculiar. The guys I was setting up meetings for seemed to know each other already, and there didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to the scheduling. Even for Africa, where delay for monetary gain was a time-honored tactic, it just felt wrong. I sent a note to Alan about my concerns. His response was distracted and a bit confused, but he promised to kick it upstairs to his father. I didn't catch it at the time, but he completely ignored my polite request to send my regards to Karen. Maybe if I'd noticed that, I wouldn't have been caught so completely flat-footed at Christmas. The Christmas ball was the most formal of all of Mr. Daniels's mixers. White tie, ball gowns, entrees nobody could pronounce, and live orchestra music in a massive ballroom were the order of the day. I would have asked Jess, but she sent me a note before the invite even reached my desk, telling me to pick her up at 5:30 on the day of the ball, and that she already had an incredible dress picked out. The dress really was stunning. When Jessie answered the door in a shimmering, opalescent white sheath dress, with matching hair, lipstick, and nail polish, I was momentarily dumbstruck. She gave a smug smile. "Cat got your tongue." I caught my breath. Wow, just wow. I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again. It was just unreal. Her smile went a little lopsided in a good way. We both recognized that we were just friends, but she liked being appreciated. She took my arm, and we headed out to my car. After dropping the car with the valet, we entered the grand ballroom, an enormous 100-year-old venue that they'd managed to keep in near-perfect condition. We found our table off in a remote corner, which bothered me a bit. As silly as it seemed, I thought we'd had a lot of fun with Alan and Karen, and I kind of expected to be a bit closer to wherever they were sitting. Still, Bethany and Ho ended up at our table, so we had entertaining conversation, and when the dancing started, we traded partners for a couple of dances. I caught a glimpse or two of Alan. And finally, during a lull, Jess and I decided to go over and socialize a bit. We were still 20 feet away when Jessie suddenly stopped and tightened her grip on my arm. Holy, who the hell is she? I followed her stare. The woman hanging onto Alan's arm wasn't Karen. She was tall with a figure that was hard to leave, with long golden red hair. She held onto Alan with an easy confidence that made it clear she felt a sense of ownership. We weren't the only ones looking at her. Nearly every man and woman on the floor had one eye on her, a mix of jealousy and barely concealed admiration. Jessie blinked. Wow, where did she come from? Alan suddenly caught us staring. Cal, Jessie, come on over here and meet Trina. The redhead turned to look at us and smiled a practiced, perfect, blinding smile. Trina Roberts, I'm Alan's fiancée. She didn't seem to recognize me at all. But I knew her. I hadn't seen her since the day before I left for basic training, but there was no way I'd ever forget her. I kept my face straight with enormous effort. Nice to meet you, Trina. I'm afraid I've been out of the country, so Alan hasn't had a chance to tell me about you. A look of relief washed over Alan's face when he realized I wasn't going to mention Karen. Yes, it's just been so hectic. We just keep missing each other. Trina and I met in October, and he went on to discuss a relatively meaningless charity ball, how their eyes had met, and how it felt like destiny. It all sounded very romantic if you ignored the unspoken part about Karen. Jessie followed my lead, introducing herself with distant politeness. We excused ourselves and wandered up to the balcony overlooking the ballroom. Dame, Jessie said, shivering. Karen never stood a chance against that. She's something. Jessa eyed me wryly. If you get a shot at dating her and pass it up, I'm getting you an eye test, a testosterone check, and maybe a mental exam. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I chuckled. Hell, I'd be out there trying to talk to her. She's pure poison, Jessie. I can feel it. Don't I know it, but it'd be an exhilarating ride, maybe. A voice came from behind us. I turned to face Mr. Daniels. Sir, I'm glad to find you two together. I need to speak with you both, And this is as good a time and place as any. Jessie edged a little closer to me and looked at him impassively. About what? Her voice was curiously flat. From your conversation, you can probably guess. Trina Roberts has her hooks so deep into Alan that they're coming out the other side. 1 minute, he's happily engaged to Karen Albright, pretty much the perfect woman for him. He paused and smiled sardonically, and admittedly for me, since it would pretty much guarantee a partnership with Albright Financial. The next thing I know, the engagement is off, my golf games with her father are canceled, and all Alan can say is, Trina, Trina, Trina. What do you want us to do? I could see genuine concern in his eyes, but I felt it was less for Alan than for the business. Look into her, find out what you can. Let me know if it's as bad as I think it is. Alan has made some relationship mistakes before, and it has cost the family more than a little money. He doesn't seem to be very good at discerning intent. Jessie shrugged. We can do that. But what do you do if it's what you think? Alan won't listen. I can see it in his face. He won't hear anything you have to say. Daniels pursed his lips. If it's all about money, I'll make her an offer. Most of the gold diggers are happy to take a quick and easy payday against the long haul. He glanced at me. I can find other ways to convince her to listen to reason. Without another word, he turned and strode off. Jessie made a sour face. Ick. I don't like him. He's the kind of guy who has to have everything his way. Like he'd just order you to show up in a schoolgirl outfit with pigtails. I looked at her incredulously. Did you forget 2 weeks ago you showed up at my door in a schoolgirl outfit with pigtails? Yeah, but that was my idea. It's different. She smirked. When the evening ended, as Jessie and I were heading up to our room, I glanced down and accidentally looked right into Trina's eyes as she watched us. Even though her eyes were emerald green and hard as ice, all I could think of was the lifeless stare of that young girl in Africa. This is bad. Really bad. Jessie stared wide-eyed at her computer screen. You mentioned that when you called me over to your office. I leaned back in the visitor chair. Define bad. Category 5 hurricane bad. Just follow the carnage. 2 marriages and 2 divorces in less than 8 years, each lasting less than a year. Named in 4 more divorces, probably paid hush money for at least that many that aren't in the legal records. Jessie pursed her lips and shook her head in slow disbelief. Daniels will insist on an ironclad prenup. I walked over to the window and stared out. Jessie studied her screen. These were all old money families, the kind that are born with prenups in hand. Her lawyer broke them. Alan is all twisted up. He broke off his engagement to Karen. He's crazy enough over her that he might do something impulsive, like elope to California. No prenup at all. Jessie tapped out a rhythm on her keyboard for a few seconds, pulled up a picture from the Christmas party, then gave a low whistle. Damn, I forgot how stunning she is. It'll be hard to pry any man away from that. I walked behind her desk and looked at our nemesis. Jessie was right. If Alan was going to throw millions of dollars away, at least she looked like she might be worth it. I wanted to tell her who Trina really was, but I came up blank when I realized how it would look. Jessie caught it immediately. Cal, what's going on? I took a deep breath and decided I had to trust someone. Laura. Her name is Laura Pike, or it was at one time. I went on to explain to Jess where I'd met her before. She looked at me wide-eyed. Daniels will never believe this is a coincidence. I think you're right about that. Even I'd have trouble believing it's a coincidence, and I know it is. So stay out of it. You tell Daniels what we've learned about Trina, and never bring up Laura. It's enough to know what he's dealing with. He'll either pay her off or scare her away. Unless she's changed a lot, scaring her away isn't going to be easy. He'll probably try to pay her off, but he better not be cheap. She probably has a pretty solid bank account. Jessie glanced at her notes. There's a 400-acre seaside estate in Mexico, a penthouse apartment in Beverly Hills, a penthouse apartment here, and a collection of vintage cars. I'll make sure he knows. That guy creeps me out. I headed over to my office and pondered my options while I idly picked my way through my inbox. An odd envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to PCM Advisory Services LLC, and I very nearly stuck it back into the outbox as misdelivered, until I saw Calvin E. Pickman on the second line. There just aren't a lot of guys with that name. I tore it open and found a business bank account statement that totaled just over $1 million. I felt sick. Whatever it was, this couldn't be good. The deposits had an obvious pattern, at least obvious to me. The deposits almost invariably followed my trips to Africa. I looked back at the address and saw it was in the main office building in the center of Dallas, but to a room I'd never been to. I thought of the strange trips and how Daniels had commented on me being handpicked by his father. I only had one person I trusted enough to ask for help. I walked back over to Jess's office and tossed the envelope down in front of her. I'm in trouble. I think I'm being set up for something. I don't know what, but this doesn't look good. I explained the pattern to her. She read the statement, wide-eyed, then hammered at her keyboard, white-faced. According to the records, you registered PCM services about a month after you started here. The suite is rented out to PCM Services by Cantic. Payments were made, but nothing else really. The suite is right next to Phillips. She paused and looked up at me. I think you're right. This smells bad. I can do some digging. You need to be careful, Calendar. I nodded. I'll pass the info on Trina to Daniels and act like nothing is wrong. I stopped and thought for a second. Could you find out more about Phillips? There may be something there. I sent Daniels the information on Trina in an email. There was no way that I wanted to meet him in person and risk him realizing that I knew something. Good businessmen can read people all too well. I got a short response back that he would take care of things. When I dropped by Jess's office, she let me know what she'd found on Phillips. Not a lot, but enough to make me worry. His full name was Eric Phillips, and he was a former DEA agent who'd left the agency under a cloud of suspicion when his partner was killed and several $1,000s had gone missing. Not enough evidence to prove anything, but it was clear what the DEA thought of him. Jess also looked into the bank account. The money was coming from an anonymous account in places like the Cayman Islands, but she was otherwise sparse on information. Her stock answer was a harried and distracted, still digging. I just have to play along until I knew what was going on. It was quiet for a couple of days while I mostly tried to figure out what to do. If Daniels was stitching me up for something, I needed to know what it was and how far it went. I was staring out the window, watching rain spatter against the pane in a numbing rhythm, when the phone rang. Please hold for Mr. Daniels. A moment later, he came on the line. Calvin, I need you to have a word with Miss Roberts. She laughed in my lawyer's face when he offered her a $400,000 payment to leave town and leave Alan alone. What do you think I can do? Push her. Get her to understand that this is not happening. I will not allow it. Sensing my hesitation, he continued, I'd send Phillips. He can be very convincing, but he is out of town at the moment. His voice made it clear that he expected me to do what I was ordered, and I needed time. I can do that. I'll have some words with her. She opened the door to her penthouse apartment and just stood back with an enigmatic half-smile and one arched eyebrow. She was even more beautiful than I remembered. Her white silk robe was nearly sheer and highlighted rather than hid her incredible figure. I stepped past her, and she pressed the door closed. Laura. At least she didn't deny it. Nice to see you. Calendar still playing the hero. Not so much anymore. I glanced around. The whole place screamed money in a million subtle ways. She leaned back against the doorframe in an almost lazy stretch, her emerald eyes locked on me. So I'm guessing Daddy Daniel sent you. He asked if I could talk with you about Alan. Glancing sideways at me, she smiled slightly. I'm a little surprised. I thought you'd still be too much of a hero to do this kind of thing. I'm just here to talk. Did you tell him you know me? Not yet. I was hoping we could deal with this quietly. She pushed off the doorframe and moved gracefully around me to a bar on the sidewall. Is that what they call it now? I'm just trying to keep everyone out of trouble. She opened a bottle and began to pour whiskey into 2 tumblers. Oh, but that's not how it works. Calendar. She turned and handed me a tumbler and took a long, slow drink from the other. So how does it work? I sipped her very expensive whiskey, savoring the taste almost as much as the sight of her. She was mesmerizing, almost addictive to watch. Daddy got concerned and sent a lawyer around to make an offer. Just a gesture, really. Leave my son alone, he promises, offering a little money and that sort of thing. And if that doesn't work, that's where you come in. Calendar. They send you. And what do I do? Oh, you know. You come by unannounced, loom over me, and make intimidating noises. She put her tumbler on the coffee table, widened her eyes, and held her hands up in mock fear, then shook her head and sighed. But that just doesn't work with me. I set my tumbler down next to hers and stepped toward her. So what next? That's when you start getting a little rough with me, make your presence felt. You don't want to leave any marks or anything I could use to gain sympathy from Alan and alienate him from Daddy, but you need to instill some fear in me, teach me a lesson. She stepped slowly toward me, moving with deliberate grace. That's what you do. I don't want to do that, Laura. She stepped forward until I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, placing a fingertip on my lip. But you have to. It's part of the script. It's just how these things are done. Not by me. I still have my integrity. Her eyes narrowed, and in a swift motion, she caught me off guard with a sharp slap. She drew back for another, and I caught her wrist. I made the mistake of staring into those glittering green eyes for a second. She pushed closer, and I was drawn into her orbit. One moment, we were standing. The next, we were locked together, driven by an urgent need, a yearning that surged out of nowhere, perhaps from everywhere. By the end of it, we lay side by side, gasping for air, trying to calm ourselves. I stared at the ceiling for a moment, reflecting on Alan. You know that isn't real. It never was. That didn't make me feel any better, but there was no point in arguing. What are you doing here, Laura? I don't want you to get hurt. It's too late for me. Calendar. I'm as hurt as I'm going to get. We both rolled onto our sides to face each other. I think Daniels is dangerous. Alan has made mistakes before, and it has been costly. So do what they're paying you to do. I searched her eyes for a second. I think we both know I could never harm you. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of pain. I've believed that about a man before. I was wrong. She paused. I married right out of college, just like Mom said. You know the type, the football player, the fast car, the family with all the money. It lasted 2 years before it all fell apart. There were tears in her voice, but none in her eyes, just cold anger. He had girls everywhere. I knew how he was when I married him, and I put up with it until I got pregnant. One day I lost it. I threw a plate at him, and he threw me down the stairs. I lost the baby and the ability to have children. She turned away for a second. Then he decided that if I couldn't give him kids, I wasn't wife material anymore. The prenup had me out the day I left the hospital, with no money. So how did this happen? I gestured around us. I found a lawyer. She broke the prenup. They're remarkably delicate things. You know, one little mistake, and it's out the window. I got half his money. Her eyes gleamed with a hard, cold light. The maid saw him hurt me. It cost money to get her to testify, but it was worth it. He spent a couple of months in jail, learning how to treat people better. And since then, well, I know how the game is played. So since your marriage didn't work, they all need to be destroyed. I expected anger, but instead, she smiled, and it was edged in ice. I've never broken a marriage where a man wasn't already playing around. They deserve it, and their wives deserve to know they're not worth keeping. I even make sure the wives get the evidence they need. Very discreetly, of course. Through my lawyer. What about Alan? What did he do to deserve this? She looked away. Alan is a special case. Believe me, this is for the best. The catch in her voice told me it bothered her. I didn't know whether I should press or not, but I was running low on trust for the entire Daniels family, so I dropped it. So what now? We're right back where we started. You go to Daniels and tell him you really roughed me up. Her mouth quirked into a genuine smile. That's close enough to the truth anyway. Just don't tell him it's mostly carpet burns. Then she added, with a hint of warmth, tell him I hinted that I might leave if the offer were a bit better. He'll raise the stakes, and I'll get out of here while things are still peaceful. You will. After I get what I came for, they'll never see me again. I lay back and looked at the ceiling. So that's that. Almost. What else is there? I think one more time should do the trick. She didn't need to say it twice. I watched the accountant transfer the money to Laura's account. Laura sat back with cold satisfaction etched on her face. There, $750,000, paid as a consulting fee from Mr. Daniels's personal investment accounts. He sighed as he closed down the laptop. Laura looked at something on her phone and nodded to her grim-faced lawyer, who then pushed a memory stick over to one of Daniels's lawyers. Miss Roberts will vacate her apartment tomorrow and leave the state of Texas for at least 5 years. The stick has a video statement by her to that effect. She also declares that she has had no interest in Alan Daniels except from a financial perspective. Aside from Laura and the Kantic accountant, only 3 lawyers and I witnessed the transaction, which all took place in her lawyer's office in an oddly sterile conference room. Laura pointedly ignored me. Daniels had insisted I be there as an implied threat, a reminder that he could do more than offer money. He, on the other hand, had distanced himself from the proceedings. Alan, of course, was unaware of the coldly financial sacrifice of his dreams of happiness. What I couldn't understand was the sheer glee in Laura's eyes as she walked past me to leave. From what Jesse and I had seen, the money just wasn't high enough to really buy her out. Consequences to the innocent are, of course, inevitable. It was almost 2:00 a.m. when I got the phone call to come down to the police station. He was uncooperative, and the cops found my security manager card in his wallet. No bail, just get him the hell out of here. The cop at the desk said he just wanted Alan gone. Alan Daniels in the drunk tank would be way too much trouble, and she didn't want it. She led me to the holding cell of the substation where he was. They really didn't want to call us, but he was getting pretty unruly. He was half sitting on the end of the single bed in the cell, but he opened his eyes as soon as we entered. He tried to lunge off the bed at me, but just flopped onto the filthy floor, out cold. The cop helped me get him up on my shoulder, then pushed an envelope at me with his belongings. Cell phone, belt, wallet, $303 in cash. You gonna be able to handle him? I'll probably be wearing whatever he drank for supper, but I'll make it. I dragged him out to my car and strapped him in the seat. I tried to think of who to call. There was no way I was handing him off to his father, and I couldn't think of anyone else who cared enough about him to watch over him. Except maybe there was that one person who might. I pulled his phone out and checked it. Poor knave Alan didn't even keep a screen lock on it. I stared at the picture he had set as his wallpaper and felt a pang of nausea. I flicked through the contacts and made the call. She didn't sound thrilled, but she answered, and I told her I'd just dump him on her doorstep if she didn't let me bring him in. I dragged him up the steps and then into the high-end townhouse while she held the door. What am I supposed to do with him? Call. Keep him away from sharp objects for a couple of days. Treat him with care for a while. Then maybe forgive him. He didn't have a chance against her. You know he didn't. Karen pointed down a hallway. I do know. That's what hurts. I didn't even see it coming. He doesn't love her or anything like that. It was just infatuation. Alan should have been smarter than that. Pisses me off. You've always been the sharper half, Karen. Remember that. I tossed Alan up on the bed and pulled his phone out, flicking it on and holding it up for her to see. Somebody sent this to his private number from a burned phone. If his father had it, he'd have thrown it in his face. If you wanted revenge, you'd have sent it from your phone so he'd feel worse. You're the only one who stands to gain from sending this anonymously. That's why I'm here." She stared at the picture of Laura in a compromising position on the carpet. I had her place wired. I knew if I waited and kept the surveillance on, she'd screw up sooner or later. I just didn't expect it to be you. You're the only real friend Alan had, the only one who didn't want something from him or his father. She hissed the last part. I sighed. There's history between me and her. It goes back a long way, long before any of us met. So I heard, in the tapes. Her real name is Laura, right? Now I get her leftovers. No, Alan almost got carried away by a wolf. We got lucky and drove the wolf away. He's not leftovers. He's a victim. If you want him to be, he can be a survivor. She grimaced at him. He's a cheating a hole. Maybe, but if you hadn't wanted him back, you wouldn't have sent the picture that way and then let me through the door with him. He's inoculated now. He'll never do it again. You made sure of that. Karen's expression softened just a bit. There probably isn't another one like her, is there? I don't know. Maybe there is, but now you know what to watch for. He'll be making up for this for the rest of his life. I rolled Alan onto his side and braced him with a pillow. And he'll thank you every day for letting him. Just keep him on his side. The rest of his life could be 10 minutes. I don't expect Alan will want anything to do with me anymore, so I wish you two the best. Karen saw me out. As I headed home, I reflected that with all Karen's manipulation and deception, maybe the only real difference between her and Laura was that she actually loved Alan. At least a little. Maybe it was enough. I dragged into work the next morning, exhausted. I opened the door to my office to find Jess already sitting on my desk next to a pile of manila envelopes. She looked somber, of course. Her hair, lips, and nails were all dead black, which may have made it a bit more obvious. It's as bad as you suspected. Daniels and Phillips are setting you up to take the fall for covering up that industrial spill on the Ubangi. Evidence tampering, witness tampering, obstruction, corruption, extortion, everything. Daniels took it on as a favor to be paid back later for one of the French allied factions in the CR. He didn't realize how bad it was going to get and decided he needed a fall guy. Phillips is doing most of the work. I sat heavily next to her. Cal, their plan only works if you can't testify. It'll only work if you're dead. I sighed. What have you got? Some emails, but mostly texts. Everybody forgets the company backs up the texts from company phones for 5 years. She pointed to the stack of envelopes. I've got it ready to mail out. FBI, Department of Justice, IRS, and every other agency I can think of. She shrugged. I even have the Department of Agriculture in there somewhere. I could just take it over to the FBI office. They take one look and drop you in jail until they can sort it out. Phillips was DEA, and Daniels has reach. You wouldn't make it alive until morning. She reached up and touched my lip with one fingertip. I may not love you, but I'll miss you. Calendar, I really will. I grabbed the stack of envelopes and headed out to the post office. It was less than half an hour later when Daniels called me. Calvin, I need you to get over to Trina Roberts' place and stop her from leaving. If she's still there. I almost told him to go to hell, but held my tongue. Why? You wanted her to leave. She's leaving. Not with $75 million of my money. It was $750,000. I was there. I watched it happen. I had a bad feeling about it, and had it checked. Somebody hacked the link, caught the computer between the display and the security system. The geeks say it's a variant of something called data scraping. Whatever the hell that means. You guys saw what they wanted you to see. They got $75 million of my money. You stop her from leaving. Phillips and I will get there as fast as we can. I stomped on the gas. Laura was dressed in jeans and a blouse, but what really caught my attention, and staggered me for a second was the smile on her face, a real, honest smile that went to her eyes. She was genuinely happy to see me. Daniels is on his way here with his enforcer. They caught your little game with the money, and he wants blood. I thought we had another 10 hours before they noticed. I even had some of the money routed to Phillips's bank account to confuse things. I could hear footsteps coming down the hall. Hide. She nodded, then slid into the closet as they began pounding on the door. Daniels and Phillips shoved into the room. She's gone. Why did you let her leave? Daniels glared at me. I pretended to look out the window. She was gone when I got here. God damn it. It'll take weeks to hunt her down and deal with her. I didn't say anything. I just needed to get them out of the apartment. Phillips seemed to be drifting aimlessly, not really searching. Daniels rubbed the bridge of his nose. Might as well do it here anyway. Phillips pulled out a small revolver, a short-barrel .38, and leveled it at me. He stepped over behind me and put one hand on my shoulder. Daniels walked over to the bar and examined the bottles, slowly pouring himself a drink. It's just business, Calendar. He pulled a case out of his jacket pocket and produced a syringe. Phillips tells me it doesn't hurt. Murdering me to cover up your mistakes seems pretty personal to me. Not everything is business. The closet door opened, and Laura stepped out behind us, a small automatic in her hand. No, not everything is business. Phillips started to turn, but she stopped him. Put the gun down. Something in her voice made it clear she'd shoot. He tossed the revolver onto the sofa, defeated. Daniels had the sheer gall to look cheated. So I guess she didn't leave. I guess not. Laura gave a shark-like smile. No, she didn't. Her voice dripped sarcasm as she waved Phillips away from me. Phillips let go and started to back away. I spun and punched as hard as I could, staggering him back into the wall. He tried to fight back, but it was too late. I hammered him until he slumped to the floor. Daniel stood rigid, looking at me in shock. What was the plan? Unsolved murder in the missing woman's apartment. Maybe get law enforcement to do your dirty work. Laura cut in. Cal, do you remember when I told you about my father? I nodded. Daniels looked lost. Robert Pike. That was his name. Though I don't expect you would remember that. She looked at Daniels with a curious tilt of her head. He shook his head slowly. You downsized his department 1 year so you could pay yourself a bigger dividend. I looked into it. The division was doing well, but you reported that you wanted a bit more cash flow for the investors, so you chopped it. That was business. Daniels's voice was slow and uncertain. Her eyes narrowed to slits. That's your answer for everything, isn't it? But it wasn't. It took me years to find out. But I did. You did it to cover up a mistake, a drug experiment that caused birth defects in testing. You eliminated the division that was supposed to do the long-term follow-up for the testing, to shift the responsibility for that to someone you could control. 30 positions, including my father's. It killed him. It took a year, but it killed him. Daniels's face went blank. So you decided to take my money. It's all about the money. Laura cut him off, her eyes blazing with intensity. I didn't do this for the money. I did it to hurt you. He stared at her, realization dawning slowly, then turned toward me with a confused look. And you? Are you here to hurt me too? No, but your sins caught up with you. In the ensuing silence, we all knew there would be no more arguments or excuses. The reckoning had come. Daniels's face hardened, his eyes darting between Laura and me. He knew he had no way out. He glanced at Phillips's crumpled form on the floor, and then gave a resigned nod, muttering, "This is how it ends, then." Laura didn't take her eyes off him. It ended years ago for you, Daniels. This is just the part where you realize it. Daniels seemed to regain his composure, adopting that familiar, cool business demeanor. He straightened, fixing his gaze on me. So what now, Calvin? You and her? Running off with stolen money. His words were edged with disdain, as though grasping at any last chance to dismiss us both. I shook my head. There's nothing left to run with. The law will catch up with you before you get a chance to run. Laura crossed her arms, her gaze as cold and unflinching as stone. You can't pay your way out of this, Daniels. And even if you could, that power you think you have is done. Daniels tried to speak, but Laura raised her hand, cutting him off. You've destroyed too much, and everyone around you is going to know exactly who you are. I've made sure of it. Daniels's face paled, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear. His voice dropped, almost pleading. Laura, we can negotiate something. If this is about my father. Laura's face hardened, and she shook her head. My father is beyond anything you could do now. But you're about to lose everything, just like he did. Daniel seemed to realize that the game was finally, completely out of his hands. He slumped against the back of his couch, his face blank, as if processing the full weight of what was coming for him. I turned to Laura. It's time for us to go. She gave one last look at Daniels, a glint of satisfaction flickering in her emerald eyes. Goodbye, Daniels. We left, leaving him alone in the silent, echoing emptiness of his penthouse. By the time the authorities arrived, the evidence against him would be overwhelming. The tangled mess of illegal transactions, covered-up scandals, and the sordid web of bribes and abuses would become the end of his empire. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the first hints of dawn just breaking on the horizon. Laura and I walked together in silence toward her car parked at the edge of the street, both of us aware that there was no turning back. As we reached the car, she paused, looking up at me with a trace of a smile, her expression softer than it had been in years. So what's next for you, Cal? She asked quietly, her tone almost playful, as if the weight of the past had finally lifted, even just a little. I'm not sure yet, I replied, my voice steady. Maybe somewhere far from here. A fresh start. She nodded thoughtfully, a faint smile touching her lips. A fresh start sounds good. For both of us. We got into her car and drove away, the city lights fading behind us. The past was behind us, and whatever the future held, at least we knew we'd left the ghosts of Dallas behind for good. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.